we'll call, for lack of a better word, operational or maybe experimental, empirical sciences, where most of the variables are controllable and they operate in the real world today. So historical sciences are very different than operational sciences, and students need to understand it. Institutional bias, we've discussed that bias can exist in institutions. We recommend teaching historical sciences. This is a little bit more depth at the higher grades. Nucleotide sequence is not determined by, are you trying to tell me something, John?
Whoops. Excuse me.
It's fine if you want me. No, I won't say that. We have inserted in the area of genetics that the nucleotide sequence, the sequence of bases in DNA, is not determined by any law, and that is a profound mystery. The language, the information carried in a DNA molecule is something that cannot be explained by the laws of chemistry and physics. Where do you get information in biology is a deep unsolved question and is fundamental to biology. Definition of evolution, we want to make it clear that the true definition of Darwinian evolution turns upon the question of it being planned, guided, or unguided, an unguided process. It's not any view of evolution that posits a guiding, whether it's a long time or a short time, is I think, an intelligent design perspective. It is not a Darwinist or materialist perspective. We had a minor clarification here regarding natural selection and genetic drift. We had the formatting problem was fixed. Random mutations are usually deleterious. We want to make it clear that the beneficial mutations that are at the base of the Darwinian macroevolutionary theory are exceedingly rare, and that is not perhaps as clear as we would like to make it, and so we've added this. Whether you can extrapolate microevolutionary processes to macroevolution is a huge leap of faith, in my view, as a scientist, and it needs to be made clear that we cannot yet make that claim. Microevolution is a wonderful research perspective. It is a theory that is working well. All of us agree and understand that microevolution works tremendously well. That is the part of evolution. When you say evolution is essential for agriculture and medicine, for biosciences, when you hear that evolution is essential for those things, what they're talking about is microevolution. Whether we arrived, how we came to be is irrelevant to agriculture. It's irrelevant to medicine. How genes work and how bacteria can mutate in response to different environments, that is relevant to medicine today, and that is microevolution. Common ancestry, a fundamental role or a tenet in Darwinism. Students learn that there is some evidence that's inconsistent with that theory. They need to hear that if they're going to make an informed decision. Similarly with origin of life, there's no comment in the current standards about origin of life. That's the beginning of biology. That is the basis for all of this. Why would we not talk about it? We don't talk about it because we haven't got a natural explanation for it. So it's not in the standards, but it is in the textbooks in spades. And the naturalistic scenario is laid out for the children to see, even though the evidence is extremely weak and contradictory. Children need to know that. This is teaching part of the controversy. Understanding does not mandate belief. This is in a teacher note. Use of scientific knowledge. These are not powerful or terribly important issues. Scientific. Thank you. Next slide. This is a chart. John, you mentioned that there were 12 individuals who wrote critiques of the draft or the minority report. I have given here the issues that they were concerned about, the names of the individuals, and if there is a red dot, they disagreed. If there was a yellow dot, there was some ambivalence. If there was a green dot, they generally agreed with the perspective that we had there. As you can see, most of the squares are filled with nothing. No comment on most of our comments. The predominant color there is red, meaning disagreement. I've had 90 papers in the peer-reviewed literature. I know what peer review is. I peer review papers. I don't come with a bias to a paper that I'm asked to review. These individuals were advocates, in my view. They were here to write bad things about this. The folks who sent them the draft knew their opinions already, and they were asked to criticize, not to evaluate objectively. So I don't take much of this in stride.
Dr. Harris, could I interrupt just a second? the timekeeper, I believe, is clocking this at 60 minutes, but actually Dr. Harris, because he took the 10 minutes for the opening remarks, has 70 minutes. And that would give Mr. Gonagary 35 minutes and would give you guys about 15. And I think that if Dr. Harris concludes his remarks at 9:45, we'll be able to satisfy that.
And next slide, please. Just a few examples of internal contradictions among these reviewers. I have, here it goes. Just 2 or 3 examples of individuals who, this guy thought this and that gal thought that. Next slide, please. Just to outline briefly what these are. Under adding informed to the mission statement, Dr. Hurd said it creates several errors and hazards. Now, you let me know what you think of the hazards are of adding the word informed to the mission statement. Dr. Heppert said this proposed change is fine. Acknowledges major unanswered questions. Dr. Wiley said, certainly we know the actual causes of the origin of all the fundamental laws. I think that's fantastic. We know the actual causes. And then Dr. Edis comments, there is no settled answer to these questions. Well, okay. I might be a little more inclined to believe that one. 8th grade historical sciences. Should we teach historical science? Dr. Bartlett says, great idea. Dr. Theobald and others says, oh, there's no difference between historical and experimental sciences, so don't bother with it. Under this one, nucleotide sequence is not determined by any known law. Dr. Miller says, well, of course, nobody's ever suggested otherwise. So in a sense, he agrees. He doesn't agree with anything we talked about, but he says there's no disagreement. Everybody knows the nucleotide sequence is not determined by law, except Dr. Brand and Dr. Wiley, who say, yeah, sure, the nucleotide sequence, we know that there are. He said, sure, there are laws. We understand that. Dr. Wiley says, however, the order of the nucleotide bases is governed by biological laws. I don't know what those are, but he seems to think there's law. Next slide. And I believe we may be done. We're not going to go over every individual. I'm done with that section then.
Dr. Harris, during your work and the work of the authors of the report, were you successful in getting some changes accepted?
Yeah, there were several things that over the season from the summertime to Christmas, I think were able to get in, and you have a list of them here. Just quickly, we were able to get the elimination of the implication that was found in the 4th grade benchmark that implied that natural phenomena, which included living systems, lacked the attribute of design. That's what made them natural. They didn't have design. So we got rid of that, and I think that's important. We deleted a reference to the natural world as being only a material world, because material world does not adequately explain the natural world. Natural world involves things like biological information and consciousness, which are not material objects. An indicator to encourage students to understand personal biases and preconceptions. We were able to add that. An important one that has a lot of implications, able to get a comment in that the role of teachers is to reinforce normative parental and legal expectations regarding unhealthy adolescent behaviors instead of letting kids make their own decisions about their health and everything else, irregardless of what their parents or teachers might have to say about it. Remove the suggestion that human behavior may be due to natural selection rather than choice. Humans make choices, and it's not because nature made me do it, it's because we make choices. Revision of introduction to eliminate a mechanism that would suppress student discussion of questions deemed by the teacher to be outside the realm of science, because we don't know what the realm of science is. These are other proposals that did not get into draft 2 that did receive significant support when we had our vote in November. Students understand that institutional bias may affect explanations. We were 14 in favor of that one, 3 against it, 6 abstentions. This did not pass because the chair ruled that this is not a 2/3 majority. The definition of science that we proposed here, the vote was 10 for it, 12 against it, and 1 abstention. So there was more than usual support for that.
Why do you think the board should adopt the ideas in the minority report?
Well, I think for three reasons. Number one, I think it's good science. I think it is good didactic science. We need to teach kids to take the data, regardless of its philosophical implications, follow the data where it leads, then we're going to make good scientists. If we put blinders on them and say you can only look over here and you must find an explanation in that box, that's not good science. And that box might be a religious box. And that's not the way to do it either. You don't have a philosophical bias, you don't have a religious bias that the data all has to fit into. That's good science. Number one, I think I'm not a lawyer, but you've told me, and I believe it, that constitutional neutrality will be served by presenting both sides of the view.
By doing good science.
If we do good science, yeah, exactly. When you do good science, you get you remove the concern about bias, and you bring neutrality to the public education. And then it also removes this tension that is present among teachers and parents and kids about how we're going to teach this. It lays it all out. Just teach the data and move on.
Thank you very much, Dr. Harris. We don't have any further to present with this witness. He's open to questions.
Sir, I have only a few questions for you. As was stated earlier, my name is Pedro Rigangaray. I represent the majority. You've told us a little bit about your beliefs and your opinions and how you came to those. I'd like to ask you for the record, first, can you tell us how old you believe the Earth is?
I don't know. I think it's probably really old.
How old is really old?
I don't really know.
You have no idea how old the Earth is?
There's theories around that the Earth is 10,000-ish years old. There are theories around that it is 4 billion years old. If it was a multiple choice test and I only had two choices and I couldn't check I don't know and I wanted to get credit for the question, I'd check old.
I understand, sir. But in all the work you have done, in all the research that you have done, in all your experience, to this day, you still do not have an opinion as to how old the Earth is.
Well, no, I have an opinion. I just don't really know. Well, my opinion would be that it's probably 4-ish billion years old.
4 billion years old. Would you specifically tell us, sir, where specifically in the standards is the term humanism mentioned?
It's not in the standards.
Where in the standards is the term naturalism mentioned?
Naturalism, I don't know that it is mentioned. I think that's part of the problem.
You don't know if it's mentioned?
It's not. I can't think of a place. Natural is mentioned a lot. Naturalism, I don't think is mentioned.
The fact is, it's not mentioned at all, correctly?
Yeah,
correct?
I think that's true.
You know that's true, don't you?
It's a lot of words there. I couldn't. I would say that probably is not there.
Would you care to take the time to find whether or not it's there, or are you comfortable?
If you wouldn't mind if I took 32 minutes to do that, that'd be fine.
Or are you comfortable with the opinion that that term is simply not there?
Yeah, I'm comfortable with that.
Where in the standards does it say that teachers and students cannot discuss criticisms of evolution?
It doesn't say that. That's, I think, implicit in the way and in the language that presents evolutionary theory, particularly the two aspects. Macroevolution is presented as a fact, not as a theory, and that's what I think opens the door to that.
You then would have to agree, would you not, sir, that nowhere in the standards are teachers and students denied the opportunity to discuss criticisms of evolution?
Correct.
If this is all about science and not about philosophy or religion, why do you keep bringing up atheism, materialism, naturalism, and humanism to this argument?
Well, in my remarks, I said it's not all about science. This is a scientific controversy that has powerful religious implications. So it's not all about science. The core is about science, but there is a penumbra, there's an umbrella out here that's philosophical and religious, and that's where it comes in. So
you would
that's
agree,
why I discuss it.
You would agree, would you not, that the purpose of science, or the guiding light for science, should be neutrality as it deals with faith?
Exactly, yes, neutrality.
You would agree that science should not involve itself with accepting a particular theistic view but rather to use the rigorous scientific process to search for answers.
Or atheistic view.
Where in the standards do you find any reference to atheistic views to be the practice in the state?
I don't find them written explicitly in the standards.
Are you aware that there are many people, millions of people throughout the world, that believe that God acts through natural causes, and that science does investigate the natural process, and that it is not incompatible for someone to be both a scientist and a religious person?
Yeah, I'm aware there are a lot of people like that.
Not a problem with that.
Well, I think they don't understand evolutionary theory very well, and I think the position that God invented evolution to make all of this is a faith statement. It's not a scientific statement.
Where do the science standards say anything about unguided or undirected?
That's the problem. They don't.
So you're suggesting that because the standards don't say that, that is a problem?
That's why we ask that it be added, because that is the fundamental theory, and it needs to be exposed. It needs to be disclosed.
Whose fundamental theory is it?
Well, I could read some quotes from evolutionary biologists who write textbooks that say it is a completely unguided process.
I'm referring in the science standards.
Science standards? No, science standards do not say that. And that is my problem.
And that's what this is about, science standards, correct?
Exactly. It's what's left out of the science standards.
Should science be involved with the process of attempting to ascertain how the natural world around us functions?
Yes.
And is it your opinion that it is appropriate to teach students supernatural answers for that process in the science curriculum?
No.
So you would agree with me that supernatural or miraculous explanations should not be allowed?
Not in science education.
Would you suggest that any time that we do not have a natural explanation, we ought to stop looking for it and invoke a miracle?
No. We don't have a natural explanation. We can keep looking for it, but there has got to come a point, just as it came with the alchemists of the Middle Ages, when someone said, enough is enough. We're not going to make gold out of lead. If you have discovered via experimentation that your hypothesis is not supported, you abandon it.
And is it your position that evolution is just simply not supported by the evidence?
My position is that microevolutionary theory is very well supported by the evidence. Macroevolutionary theory is not well supported by the evidence. One can build a story, but the evidence, I think, is lacking for a firm conviction.
You talked earlier about bias. Is it your opinion that the American Association of Science is biased towards intelligent design?
Yeah.
Is it your opinion that the National Association of Biology Teachers is biased against intelligent design?
Well, they're biased against non-naturalistic explanations of anything. So, yes.
Is it your opinion that the National Academy of Science is biased against intelligent design?
I don't know to what you're referring there. Can you help me out with that?
I'm just asking you, sir.
Oh, no, I'm not aware of that. I'm aware of statements from those other two groups that specifically address that issue, but not from the NAS.
In your presentation, you talked about the overwhelming amount of bias that intelligent design faces. Is that a bias that, in your opinion, is as a result of the lack of scientific processes that intelligent design fails to present, the lack of research, or is it, in your opinion, simply that those particular institutions discriminate against you because of a particular bias that they may have?
There's a tremendous amount of data supporting intelligent design. Every biochemical journal you would open would find evidence for intelligent design. It's there on every page. It's just that the people that write those have blinders on, and they don't want to discuss, they don't want to see it. That's my view, my opinion, that if one were to look at the data objectively and ask, where did that protein come from, and address that question, you would be forced into, if you're objective, to say, well, I don't know, but it sure looks designed.
Well, to say I don't know, in your opinion, then the alternative that should be taught is that it was designed.
I think we can determine that something was designed with great alacrity. Most anybody can do that.
Who is the designer?
That I don't know.
Would the designer imply a supernatural being?
If you define supernatural for me.
Something other than human?
Other than human?
Something
I think
other than the
something
biological processes?
Something, I think that's, it's conceivable that something like that could exist.
When you talk about an intelligent designer, to you personally, what does that mean?
To me personally, because I hold to the Christian faith, I believe that would be the God of the Bible. But that's a faith position. That's not a scientific position.
So the designer, according to you, would be a Christian type
Well,
designer.
and if I was a Muslim, I would say the designer is Allah. If I was any other faith, I might say, that's a faith position. That's not science. That's my opinion outside of the science classroom.
So you would agree with me then that when we cannot find an answer in science at this moment, that it would be appropriate to teach as science, that since we don't know the answer right now, it is appropriate to assume that it was, by intelligent design, someone's God.
No, I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think the first thing we say is something you said earlier, is we don't know. And we would go a long ways in this discussion by simply having the majority view say, we don't know, instead of saying, we do know, and this is what it is, it's a naturalistic process. I prefer, we don't know, because that's honest.
You don't suggest that science says that they have answers for everything, do you?
No, not everything. We have quite a list in the Minority Report.
You understand that science is a quest for knowledge.
Quest for knowledge, right.
Where in the standards do you find a definition or indication in any way whatsoever to atheism or philosophical materialism?
I see it between the lines. I don't see it written anywhere.
You see it between the lines.
In the presentation of unproven theories as fact.
Unproven theories according to you.
According to me, exactly.
Do the standards state anywhere that science or evolutionary theory is based on atheism or in any way in conflict with belief in God?
No, standards do not address that.
Is it your opinion that to believe in evolution, one must adhere to naturalism?
If you would define evolution for me.
Evolution as it is in the mainstream of scientific understanding.
That's what I need to have defined.
You don't understand what I mean by evolution.
I know that's the slipperiest term in town today. And that term can mean change over time, which I agree with completely. That term can mean all that we have in the world today is an accident, and I disagree with that. So I need a definition.
Is evolution defined in draft 2?
It's defined in toto. Yeah, it's described. Actually, evolution is, and I don't think it's described quite like that as a definition, like a dictionary definition. But it's certainly benchmark 3, standard 3. The 8th to 12th grade is all evolution.
And is it your opinion that that definition stands for naturalism and some sort of religion?
The uncritical acceptance of a perspective that says all of life is here by chance, which is, I think, what the majority report portrays.
Where does it say that?
That's what I see in toto. In words, it doesn't say it. That's what I see
So
as
once
the entire.
again, you are assuming that that's what it says.
Well,
not
I've been
what
there at all
words
the meetings.
actually
I don't-
say. Oh, just please hang on. You are simply making an assumption that that's what it means, even though that is not what it says, correct?
I am making the assumption based on working on those standards for the last 9 months. Yes.
The question is, that's not what the standards say,
No.
correct?
Then we think they need to say it more clearly what evolution is. That's why we have a minority report.
And is it your opinion that mainstream science today is in fact analogous to religion?
No, not at all. We're just talking about a very tiny sliver of science today that concerns itself with the origin of life, the origin of the universe, that area, I think, is fundamentally driven by a naturalistic philosophy, but that is a very, very small piece of science.
Based on your interpretation, is it your opinion that the majority are atheists?
No.
You would agree, would you not, that there is absolutely no conflict between individuals possessing a particular faith and their ability to work in science?
I agree.
And you would agree, would you not, that it is exceedingly important that science, for the betterment of humanity, for the education of our children, and for the separation of church and state, should not include theistic views?
I think it shouldn't include any philosophical or religious views.
Thank you very much for being here, Dr. Harris. I think you've clarified for me, and I hope for some of the spectators, what our controversy is really about. I just want to tell you that I have 3 daughters who are on science fields, a doctor, a veterinarian, and a high school science teacher. I was cleaning out my closets of some of their old textbooks, so I thought, well, I'll just look. And yes, I found 4 different types of definitions concerning evolution. And I agree with a lot of what you have said. I have no problem with the definition of evolution where it applies to microevolution. Thank you very much for your explanations.
Dr. Harris, what is the purpose of science?
What is the purpose of science? I think the science is to understand the natural world.
I heard you agree a few minutes ago that it was a quest for knowledge.
Well, it is that as well. That's kind of the way we get there. But the goal, I think, is to understand how the world works.
Is science a search for truth?
Yes, regarding the natural world, right?
Is there a difference between evolution that we can observe and evolution that we cannot see?
Sure, yeah. Evolution you cannot see. We don't know. It's actually, again, there's that slippery term. But if we're talking about hypotheses about how different life forms came to be, if that's what we mean by evolution, and we weren't there to see how it happened, we don't know how it happened, and we have to leave it at that.
That's commonly called microevolution, macroevolution by some.
Micro, I think we do see. We can watch that in the laboratory. That's very well substantiated. Responses of bacteria to media with antibiotics and developing resistance, that's fine. They don't become new bacteria. They're just a change in a particular protein in their cell membrane that allows them to live in that environment. That is not evolution. That is adaptation to an environment.
Does mainstream science differentiate between microevolution and macroevolution?
Not clearly, in my view. I think that needs to be more clear. To me, that it's the smearing of those two together that is the problem that's brought us here today.
Why does mainstream science of today not differentiate between them?
Well, I think that's a philosophical choice. It's a very complicated question. Since the mid-19th century, there has been a move to make science only natural processes only, and define it that way. And I think that's wrong. Science to me is not a list of allowed and disallowed explanations. It's a search. It's a method. It's a process, a systematic, careful process where you control variables and measure outcomes and draw conclusions that don't go beyond the data.
I hear implicit in your answer, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but I am trying to understand that is a bias. Is that a fair analysis of what you just said, or is that incorrect?
Well, it's a very general statement I just made. I think one would have to look at a specific situation, but in general, when we're dealing with origins, which is the topic of the Minority Report, is where did things come from. Experiments done today, in real time today, can inform that question. It can bring us closer to understanding perhaps ways that we could have come to be. But even if you could, by an undirected natural process, produce life in a test tube without an investigator manipulating anything, if that even happened, that would still, that would be an impressive accomplishment. That would still not prove that's how it happened in the first place. It would only show that it happened there. One could not conclude logically that therefore you have explained and proven where life came from. So even the most wildly successful experiment conducted today would not prove what happened in history.
I heard you say earlier that one of the goals is to achieve scientific neutrality.
Well, I kind of mean constitutional neutrality, because the neutrality I'm talking about is, as I understand the Constitution, when the state endeavors or touches upon an area of religion, it's required to be neutral and not to advocate or support or denigrate any view. Simply neutral.
So what is the best way to avoid, to achieve that? What is the best evidence that you're trying to achieve the neutrality?
That you allow all relevant perspectives to be voiced. That all the data that impinges upon the question on the table is considered, and you haven't, by definition, eliminated some perspectives that actually have meaningful things to say about the question at hand. So you just present all the data. You allow all chips to fall where they will.
One of the things that I have promoted is the idea of empirical science. And I define that as what is observable, measurable, testable, repeatable, and falsifiable. I have those criteria because I believe that that is the best way to avoid bias, the best way to achieve neutrality. Is that something that many scientists ascribe to, or a few scientists, or how would you
Well,
say
I think
that?
the vast majority of scientists ascribe to that in their day-to-day work, because the vast majority of scientists work in what we call operational sciences today. They study the world as it works today, and they want to understand when people get sick, why do they get sick, and what can we do to fix it? When crops don't grow, why don't they? When the oceans warm, why are they warming, and what can we do to cool them down? That's operational. So that's what 90, I don't know the percent, most scientists work in, and they operate on exactly those characteristics that you described. It's when we get into questions of origins, historical sciences, that falsifiability, for example, is impossible. You cannot strictly falsify something that may have happened 1 billion years ago or 1,000 years ago. So historical science have a different character. I think they're a valuable type of science, but we have to be more careful with the way we treat their conclusions.
You stated earlier that in many biochemistry journals, the idea that a code is implanted in DNA, and what defines the idea that that is a code of design?
Well, I didn't say code was implanted in DNA. I say DNA is a code. It contains a sequence of chemicals that, in common parlance, spell out something. They spell out the shape of proteins, and the proteins that they produce have function and produce living, reproducing organisms. So there's function. And simply the identification of a code, I don't know of any code. Now, maybe there is a code. I don't know of a code, which is where one set of symbols corresponds to another set of symbols and is used to communicate a message. I don't know any example of a code coming from a non-intelligent source. So, to me, it's not irresponsible. It is not. It's perfectly logical to say the code in DNA may have come from some intelligence. But that's where I think I have to stop with it.
Why do many mainstream scientists, evolutionists, if you will, refuse to accept the idea that code is DNA, or DNA is a code?
Oh, no, I don't think anybody refuses. I just don't think they think about it very deeply.
Okay.
I mean, everybody knows it's a code. I just, in my opinion, they haven't sat down and taken a deep breath and said, where did that come from? And really think about the fact that the bonds along the backbone of the nucleic acid are sugar phosphate bonds. Every bond is identical. There's nothing chemically that's different between the bond between an adenine and a glycine, or a guanine nucleotide containing a nucleoside. So the fact that they form this chain is kind of like letters on a page. The letters don't have to be in that sequence. When they are in that sequence, they communicate information, but they don't have to be that way. In the same way in DNA, the letters don't have to be in the sequence they are by any chemical reason, any law, any natural cause that we know of. Therefore, just like text in a book, the code in DNA has the fingerprints of intelligence. But the nature of that intelligence, the purpose of that, how it happened, I don't know, but I can come to a conclusion of, at least a tentative conclusion of design, without knowing anything about where it came from. If a Coke bottle fell out of the sky into an African desert, and I was a native, you know the movie I'm talking about, Gods Must Be Crazy. Those people knew that Coke bottle was designed, but they had no idea what it was. There's an entire wing in one of the museums in D.C. that's dedicated to objects that we don't know what they are, but we know they're objects made by humans. So I mean, you don't have to know where it came from. You don't have to know who did it. You don't have to know why it was done. You don't have to know when it was done to come to a conclusion that something was designed.
When DNA is injured somehow or other, what is the tendency for that DNA strand to do?
To cease to serve its purpose well. It generally will. It totally depends on where the mutation is and the extensiveness of the mutation, but in the same way that if you garbled the letters in a paragraph, you would lose the sense of the sentence that paragraph had.
You talked about earlier that mutations that are beneficial versus harmful.
Mm-hmm.
What are the mutations that are beneficial?
There are in some benefits. There are very few, but the one that I would mention is there's something we call a gain of function mutation, where a gene or a particular organism has at one time lost a function, then had another mutation that brought it back. That's not really advancing anywhere. It's just sort of returning to ground zero again from being in the basement. So that kind of mutation can happen, but by and large, I'm not a geneticist, but as I understand genetics and mutations, I work with them to some extent. Almost all mutations are considered either neutral or harmful to the further existence of the organism.
Okay. And I thank you very much for your time. Anything else?
Thank you.
You do?
Dr. Harris, I want to also thank you for coming. I wish I had had you in my office to answer all the emails that came our way from across the country. You did a great job, thanks. I just have one question. If you recall, and I apologize, I don't have draft 2 in front of me, but do you recall grade 8, it would be standard 3, benchmark 3, the definition of evolution? Was it an assessment item?
We have not, to my knowledge, we have not yet decided, because this is still somewhat up in the air, this section on evolution, we have not decided what is going to be tested, what's going to be assessed and what's not. So nothing is marked at this point for assessment.
Is it your feeling that the committee believes that should be an assessment item?
I think that kids need to understand Darwinian evolution.
Right.
They need to understand it in spades. And the problem we have here is that people don't understand it. And so I would hope somebody put a great big red X by this and test it, because it needs to be really highlighted.
Okay, then grade 7, evolution is a theory. Do you recall if that is an assessment item?
That I don't believe is actually, I think that is part of teacher notes, as I recall. So that
Okay.
would not be assessed because, just kind of
Okay.
background.
My point is that the way these are written, wouldn't you agree that the state assessments are written around the standards, and that it's very critical that we get every word correct and
Yes.
reflected in appropriate scientific inquiry?
Yeah, no, I agree with that completely.
Okay. And then to add informed to the mission statement, what were some of the reasons not wanting to add the word informed?
Yeah, it's a good question. Why would you not want to add that word? I think in the discussion, as I recall it, Mr. Krebs said, and Jack, you correct me if I'm wrong. I can trust you to do that. That on its surface, there's nothing wrong at all with adding the word informed, but what Jack objected to was all the explanation and verbiage below it, and then he thought there was some kind of a Trojan horse, I think, coming in with it. So, is that a fair assessment, Jack? And so, given the whole. Oh no, I don't. I guess I'm not free to do that.
Wait a minute. I think, in all fairness, he's asked a question of Mr. Krebs, and Mr. Krebs should be permitted to answer it.
We're probably down to 1 minute.
Well, it's not fair.
Was that
I'll hold a brief press conference at Brett.
Not fair.
Brief? Jack will be happy to address that.
That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you.
We've completed this session a little bit early, so we're going to take a 10-minute break starting at 10:20. We will respond and be back at 10:30.
Members of the committee, I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Jonathan Wells. Dr. Wells has come from the state of Washington. Where do you live there?
I live near Puget Sound, northwest corner of Washington State.
Okay. Well, I really appreciate your coming all this way to talk about the issue. To get started, Dr. Wells, would you please explain a bit about your background and your qualifications to comment on the minority report? And in particular, I believe you're going to be addressing the evolution benchmark at Standard 3, Benchmark 3, grades 8 through 12.
Yes, thank you for inviting me. I earned a bachelor's degree in physical science, which included mostly physics and geology, in the late 60s from the University of California at Berkeley. Went on to get a PhD in religious studies at Yale in the 70s and early 80s, and did my research there on the 19th century Darwinian controversies, the religious and theological and philosophical aspects. A few years after that, because of my interest in the Darwinian controversies, I went back to school, proof that I'm actually certifiably insane, if you want to know the truth. Maybe I shouldn't make jokes here, but that's what people told me at the time. I went back and got a second PhD in biology, molecular and cell biology, again at the University of California at Berkeley, where I focused on embryology and evolution. Since then, I worked as a supervisor of a medical laboratory in California for a while, then was asked to come up to Seattle as a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute there.
Could you tell us a bit about the Discovery Institute and your relationship to it now?
The Discovery Institute is a public policy institute, a not-for-profit institute. It actually pre-existed the current controversy. It has projects that focus on regional cooperation between Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia, specifically transportation issues, fisheries issues, technology issues. And in 1996, the Center for Science and Culture was founded at the Discovery Institute, specifically to address the Darwinian controversies and public education. And I was invited to come up then as a senior fellow, which is where I am now. I moved up in '98 with my family. I'm not an employee of the Discovery Institute. I receive a research grant for which no goods or services are required. but obviously my interests and the interests of the Center for Science and Culture coincide closely, or I wouldn't be there. I'm too fast. I have a fellowship, a research fellowship from Discovery Institute, which does not require goods or services, so I'm not an employee. But the research I do is obviously of interest to the Institute.
Could you describe a bit of that research?
Specifically, probably most notoriously, in 2000, I published a book, Icons of Evolution, in which I showed that many of the major images used in biology textbooks as evidence for evolution, in fact, do not fit the evidence. The one I first discovered was the picture of embryos, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, because I was studying embryology, and I would compare the pictures with the embryos I was actually looking at and realized that there was a discordance there. And I went on from there to study various other icons and found similar discrepancies between the icon and the evidence.
In your program, I guess you will tell us what an icon is.
Well, I call them icons because they're pictures, first of all. They're pictures that have taken on an aura that goes far beyond their evidentiary value. They become symbols almost of evolutionary theory, and in that sense have an almost iconic status. That's why I call them that.
Your book was published in 2000?
Yes, revised slightly in 2002.
And I believe it has been reviewed by a number of different people, scientists. Is that correct?
Yes, it has. The number of published reviews is probably somewhere around a dozen, of which roughly half are favorable and half are extremely unfavorable.
What about the unfavorable criticisms?
Well, I responded to them in an article I posted on the Discovery website a few years ago called Critics Rave Over Icons of Evolution, because they were rave reviews in the sense that they were extremely angry with me. And I hope I showed in that response that on the scientific level, nobody has actually rebutted the claims I made. Instead, typically what happens is my credentials are impugned, my integrity is attacked, and various other things. It's a campaign more of character assassination than of dealing with the evidence.
I have also heard the argument that even though the icons themselves may be incorrect in various ways, they still represent deep fundamental truths. Is that a criticism that's been made?
Yes, it has. But I try to be very careful in my book to say exactly why the icons were wrong. For example, the peppered moth icon, which has pictures typically of peppered moths resting on tree trunks where we now know they don't normally rest, is used as evidence for natural selection. Well, I have no quarrel with natural selection, so I'm not saying that the falsity of that icon refutes natural selection. But for each icon that I deal with, what I do say, and I think legitimately, is that if this is thought or presented as some of the best evidence we have for Darwinian evolution, and so much of it is false, where does that leave the theory? Because sooner or later, if a theory is going to be scientific, you have to test it against the evidence. And if piece after piece of that evidence turns out to be exaggerated or distorted or even faked, then I think the theory itself at some point becomes suspect.
Your criticisms in Icons of Evolution, I've read the book, tend to weaken evolutionary theory. Would you agree with that?
The evidence is what weakens evolutionary theory.
Is that good?
I have no desire to weaken any theory except by comparing it with the evidence. What I don't want to weaken is science. But science thrives on comparing theory with evidence.
Do you believe science education should oppose curriculum that has the effect, whether intended or not, has the effect of weakening evolution or putting it in a bad light?
Well, I'm certainly no supporter of weakening the treatment of evolution in science curricula. In fact, I think, if anything, students should learn more about evolution than they're currently being taught. They need to be taught the theory more clearly, they need to be taught the evidence for it, and the evidence against it. And in most cases, often, I see a rather superficial treatment of evolution that doesn't really get into the issues. And I find the issues extremely interesting, and my experience, my limited experience with students, is that they find it interesting too.
You've read the Minority Report.
I have.
What is your overall assessment of the proposals in that report?
My overall assessment is that it improves the set of standards that were on the table before the Minority Report, because it raises issues that I think are important to raise in the science classroom.
Regarding the definition of science, one of the proposed changes in the Minority Report is to substitute a definition of science that was very similar to a definition adopted in Ohio, and I believe you're familiar with that definition. Would you care to comment on that? And I will put that up on the screen here. There it is. The Minority Report. Whoops.
Okay.
It may be a bit hard for you to read that. Okay. The definition of science is a systematic method of continuing investigation that uses observation, hypothesis testing, measurement, experimentation, logical argument, and theory building to lead to more adequate explanations of natural phenomena. Maybe you could comment on that definition.
Well, I will, and I'll comment also on the statement that it's replacing up there, namely, science is the human activity of seeking natural explanations for what we observe in the world around us. Now, I realize that there's room for a lot of controversy on a topic like this, so my first tendency in a situation like this is to go look for data. So I went looking at the science standards for every state in the United States. I literally spent 2 days glued to my computer, not very healthy, but I found the science standards, or what I could find, for all 50 states. And I was actually somewhat surprised to learn, when I did that in defining science as the human activity of seeking natural explanations, namely the majority view, is absolutely unique in the United States. There is no other state in the Union that defines science that way. In fact, what I found, if I can hold this up for the board, the yellow states have no explicit definition of science that I could find on the internet. The green states all define science in terms of a process of inquiry, formulating hypotheses, seeking evidence, testing the hypotheses against the evidence to find better explanations for the natural world or natural phenomena. In this sense, the Kansas definition that preceded this controversy was idiosyncratic. No other state has that definition. No other state gives priority to the explanation we're supposed to find. Everyone else gives priority to the process. In this sense, the minority view, in my opinion, is actually putting Kansas back in the mainstream of American science education. And as a scientist myself, and I have the data here, which I'll hand out to you later, as a scientist myself, I agree with this. I would not like to see science become an enterprise where we're told at the outset what sorts of explanations we're supposed to find. For me, science is an exciting, open-ended search for truth. And the way that's conducted is through hypothesis testing. And I think the minority view replacement definition here is much more in line with that than the definition of science as seeking natural explanations.
Dr. Wells, I'd like to turn now to the evolution benchmark. This is the benchmark that you're going to talk about and that you have a PowerPoint presentation cover.
Yes, if that's okay. The reason I'm using PowerPoint is because so much of this is visual, which is why I wrote about icons. So, this is the part of the benchmark that I will specifically focus on in my PowerPoint. namely the view that living things in all the major kingdoms are modified descendants of a common ancestor. Now, Darwin's theory, and I'm going to be speaking here today about Darwinian evolution. Evolution, as you've already heard, is a very broad concept. And I'm specifically addressing Darwin's theory, namely that living things are modified descendants of creatures that lived in the very distant past. Descent with modification is what Darwin called his theory. The modification part, Darwin thought, was due primarily to natural selection acting on random variations, which in modern versions of Darwinism come from genetic mutation. So in a nutshell, that's the theory I'm addressing here. The only figure in Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, was this one. And by it, he meant to illustrate what he meant by his theory. So in the distant past, we might have a single species down here, and he draws two here, that converge further down. We have a species here that has a variety of forms in it. Two parts of this population might get separated, and one form would go this way, the other form would go that way, and eventually split into two species. Further down the road, the differences might become greater. Instead of two species, we might have two genera, or families, or orders, or classes, or right up to the highest levels of the biological hierarchy. Now, no one doubts common ancestry at the level of the species. I have no problem believing that all of us in this room, somewhere in the distant past, share a common ancestor. But is it true at higher levels? Are all the different types of animals related by common ancestry, for example? Do we share a common ancestor with a worm or a fly? That's the question I'm going to address here. And we have to address questions like this in science by looking at the evidence. So, of all the levels that we could look at, I'm choosing this one. Actually, we already know that there's substantial doubt about the ones above it. But I'm going to look at the animal phylum. The phylum is the group that includes, for us, it would be us and the mammals and the alligators and the fish. Another phylum would be the phylum that includes sea urchins and sea stars. Another one would be the mollusks, the snails and the squids and so on. And so on. So these are the phyla, plural, the major different kinds of animals. Now, according to the benchmark, this is proposed to be added by the Minority Report, okay? This view that the major kingdoms, here I'm actually dealing with phyla, which is a smaller unit, are modified descendants of a common ancestor has been challenged in recent years by three things: molecular evidence, fossil evidence, and embryo evidence. And I'll deal briefly with all three of those. First, the molecular evidence. I'm going to pick, just to illustrate this, 7 phyla, 7 major groups. We're in the chordate group. Here are the starfish. These are flatworms, roundworms, mollusks, arthropods, which include the crabs and the insects, and earthworms. Now, if we look at the molecules in these organisms and we group them according to the similarity of their molecules, we can rearrange them thus. So the molecules here are most similar. They're more similar to each other than they are to these, for example. These are more similar than they are to those. So we can regroup these according to the similarities in this particular molecule, which I won't try to describe in technical detail, but it's one commonly used. Now, if we construct a tree, an evolutionary tree, following Darwin's pattern, based on this molecule, we get something like this. But be clear that the only data we have are up here. We have the molecules from these organisms, and the rest of this is inferred based on the assumption that they share a common ancestor. What's interesting is when we look at these molecules, various discrepancies immediately appear. For example, the tree I just showed you from 18S RNA doesn't fit the classical tree that had been drawn on the basis of morphology or anatomy. Animals that are close together up here are far apart over here. Not only that, if I pick a different molecule, 28S RNA, I get a different tree again. Okay, here's the 18S tree, here's the 28S tree. Okay, once again, animals that are closely related by one are not closely related by another. Imagine if you found out that your grandfather was not the least bit related to you, but, related to people half a world away. I mean, this is pretty fundamental biology stuff, It matters who you're related to. Even worse, if we take 18S RNA and submit it to two different laboratories, as it was done in this case, again we get two different trees. So the molecular evidence is shot through and through with discrepancies. A recent article in Nature just last week shows that this controversy is continuing. These trees here, it shows these two trees in Nature. Here, we, the chordates, are most closely related to the arthropods, or the insects. But according to this other molecular study, we're way off here, and the insects are more closely related to roundworms. Now, these are not trivial issues in molecular or evolutionary biology. So, the inconsistencies in evolutionary trees based on molecular comparisons have to actually be explained away